Alrighty, we're ready to begin. We're here for the Lovecraft's Providence and Arkham panel. And before we begin, I figured I'd just let everybody introduce themselves. So let's start with Will on the far end there. We'll just come on back to me and we'll go from there.
Hi, I'm Will Murray. A long time ago, I wrote tons of articles on Lovecraft in his world, and I don't write that many anymore. I do write other things, and I probably don't want to know about those since this is a Lovecraft conference, but I've written about 60 books or so.
I'm Faye Ringel. I wrote about Lovecraft in Lovecraft Studies and for Necrophile, but my book is New England's Gothic Literature, History and Folklore of the Supernatural, and that has a large Lovecraft component. And since then, mainly I've written articles on Lovecraft for reference books and things like that.
My name's Steve Mariconda. I've been writing about Lovecraft for about 30 years, and primarily interested in Lovecraft's prose style and in historical biographical criticism. I've been lucky enough to have had my articles collected in a book from Hippocampus Press called Art, Artifact, and Reality. It just came out. Thank you.
I'm Kiernan. I'm an author, and I live in Providence. Among a tremendous number of authors who've been a very important influence, Lovecraft is towards the top of the list. Also, as far as I'm concerned, this is Lovecraft's Providence, Arkham, and Innsmouth. So.
Absolutely. Lovecraft's real and fictitious New England towns. I'm St. Joshi. I'm not sure even why I'm here, but because I haven't done a whole lot I haven't really done all that much study of the topography. I've learned from the work of others. I did live here in Providence for 6 years as a student, so I think that helped me ground me in the lore of Providence.
I'm Donovan Loucks. Excuse me. I've been doing too much talking today. I'm sure you have too. I'm the webmaster of the HP Lovecraft Archive at hplovecraft.com, and my specialty behind the scenes is doing things like helping ST with geographical data. I found about 1,200 points of interest related to Lovecraft, mostly from his letters. Visited about half of those, and one of these years I'll put a book together on all that. So, because the title of the panel is Providence and Arkham, I actually wanted to start out with kind of an unusual question. Well, the official term.
And Kingsport.
And I actually wanted to throw out kind of an unusual question, and that is, I wanted to get everybody's opinion on how they believe Providence itself, rather than Salem or other locales, influenced Lovecraft's Arkham. And if anybody had any ideas on that in particular, I've got a couple things myself, but I wonder if anybody else has any opinions.
Well, let me say off the top of my head, this unexpected question. Providence has a major university, there's a nice river running through it, and similar general topography. I've always felt that Lovecraft, when he created his fictitious cities, built them out of real places, but not literally the real place. And I can tell an anecdote that maybe I'll tell later on about that. But, you know, Providence as his natal city, so to speak, probably was a template on at least a subconscious level to any metropolis he wrote about that was New England, instead of New England. Is that a good generic answer to an unexpected question?
Well, just that besides the university, there is no university in Salem. I mean, now there's Salem State, but that was a tiny teacher's college in his day.
I actually have no idea what the answer to that one is, but I will say this, that just to be contentious, somewhere I read, and I would attribute it to the person who thought of it, but at this moment I don't know, that Providence is something of an anti-Arkham. That is to say that Providence is the location of good, and in the Providence stories where there are horrors, like the shunned house, the horrors are vanquished at the end, whereas at Salem or Arkham, that's not the case. And again, I apologize to whoever came up with that concept. That was ST, so I can footnote that one to ST. Sorry, ST.
The one thing ST had to say on the subject, and you stole it.
You should sit to my right next time.
Well, I'm not, frankly, I don't quite understand why Lovecraft created fictitious cities. I don't know why we have Innsmouth when there's Marblehead and Gloucester. I don't know why we have Arkham when there's Providence. But, that said, and I, my own stories that are in a cosmic horror Lovecraftian vein, I always use actual locations, whether it's the North Shore of Massachusetts or Boston or Providence or Manhattan. And then you have, of course, the stories like you're saying, where you have Red Hook, you have Brooklyn, you have Providence. I don't know, that's sort of a non-answer.
Well, okay, I mean, okay, why did he invent Arkham and Innsmouth and Kingsport and Innsmouth? Even though they're based on real places, I think Lovecraft wanted the liberty of fudging reality a little bit. Because, even though his imagination, I think, needed to be rooted in the real, he didn't want to stay there. I take the example, Donovan and I have been discussing this for a bit. Even a story set in Providence, like the case of Charles Exeter Ward, Ward's house is numbered 100 Prospect Street. It is not 100 Prospect Street, it's 140 Prospect Street. Why did he change that? Was he afraid, if the novel got published, that people would go up on the door and say, hey, does Charles Exeter Ward live here? But they could have done the same thing with 100 Prospect Street. There is a house at 100 Prospect Street. That seems like a funny change to me, and now I thought it was just to protect the privacy of the people at 140, but that doesn't make any sense now. So I'm puzzled at that weird little change, and it perplexes me. But in terms of the fictitious towns, I do think he wanted a little more imaginative liberty. I mean, Salem itself, which is theoretically the basis for Arkham, aside from the university, I think didn't have quite all the elements that he wanted, and he wanted to, make the town a little more spooky than what Salem actually was. That's all I can think of.
What ST mentions about the house at 100 Prospect Street is the Henry Sprague house, and it's a pretty unremarkable house. And so if Lovecraft really was, like you said, trying to protect the privacy of the people at 140 Prospect, then why did he give a completely
non-number?
Yeah, either non-number or for that matter, just make it a street name altogether, like making up an entire town. So why he did that is kind of baffling. So Caitlin, you mentioned adding Innsmouth to the title of the
in part because even more than I've never used it, never used Miskatonic, even more than I have used Innsmouth, and more than Providence probably, or the Providence stories. The Shadow over Innsmouth is the story that I've kept coming back to, and I must have written, I don't know, at least 10, I've written 250 short stories, but I've written at least 10 Innsmouth stories. And I haven't done a great deal of Lovecraft scholarship, so I feel a little weird up here, but I became very obsessed in the early 2000s with finding Innsmouth and actually finding Innsmouth. And I think I did find Innsmouth. It's kind of complicated, but so that's my thing. And at some point, I don't know why, it's something I do want to read sometime.
One thing that I find interesting when I look at the genesis of Arkham is the way it has changed over time. Will, in his articles, talks about how Arkham kind of shifts around, western Massachusetts and so on. I think it kind of coalesced, so maybe Will can give some background on how he thinks it kind of migrated over time.
Well, of course, that's still a controversial theory, but...
Which is a good topic for panels.
Yeah. When Lovecraft was first talking about his imaginary towns, Dunwich and Arkham, they seemed very rural. And very quickly in his canon, he stops writing about Dunwich, but he continues to write about Arkham. And it seemed to me in doing research, this is now 20 years ago, I was writing these articles, these infamous articles. When the Quabbin Reservoir project was first put forth in the late 20s, by necessity, they had to raise several towns, including one called Greenwich, another called Enfield, and a couple others that are escaping my consciousness right now. And so the area of Dunwich, and I don't mean the town, I mean the area, was essentially submerged for the Quabbin Reservoir, a reservoir that didn't get finalized until a year or two after Lovecraft's passing. And it seemed to me, reading the early stories, the Arkham he was describing was rural and very near Dunwich, which is not near Salem at all, which is a coastal town, of course. And it seemed to me that because of the Quabbin project, he had to move what he could, or he liked the name Arkham, and since there was a new Salem in that area at that time, and there was a Salem on the East Coast, what he did was he sort of moved Arkham towards the ocean, because for whatever reason he liked the name or liked the idea. And since he wasn't writing at that point, or at any point, a absolutely connected series of tales. You know, some stories were connected, but they weren't all connected. There wasn't a Cthulhu mythos by any name in his early career. He probably just felt the liberty of doing that. And I've always put forth, and I still believe, that when he created these imaginary towns, he tended to take a town as a template, tended to move it or displace it somewhat, and idealize it. Again, to give him the liberties to do things. And I want to bring an anecdote in that tells you this is not unique to Lovecraft, and I'll try to say it as quickly as I can because I think it's illuminating. I knew Walter Gibson, the creator of The Shadow. He was also the editor of Tales of Magic and Mystery, who the editor bought Cool Air. And he used to tell me of the technique of creating imaginary localities in his shadow stories. And one of them, specifically in his first Shadow novel and some others, he had a Long Island suburb called Homewood. Now, he didn't know Long Island, but he needed to set a story in Long Island. So what he did, he told me, was to take a fashionable town in his native Pennsylvania called Swarthmore, relocate it to Long Island, and give it an imaginary name, which gave him a visual context when he's writing the story, so he knew where the streets were and what it looked like and sounded like and all that. But then he had the liberty to do whatever he wanted with the town, because it was completely imaginary. And that's what Lovecraft did. He created something out of something, but it wasn't literally that something. Arkham isn't any Salem. Arkham is in the general vicinity of Salem. It's like Salem, but it's also like Danvers, and also like maybe whatever you want to drag into it. That's a long-winded way of answering the question. But basically Lovecraft, and this is another important point we don't think about. There were lots of lawsuits in those days where a writer would accidentally name a real person and would destroy his career and would create problems for the magazine publisher. When Lovecraft would write of Innsmouth and had a character named Zadok Allen, they probably gave the guy the name Zadok Allen because there probably really wasn't a Zadok Allen in the entire planet at that time, but he couldn't be sure. So part of the reason for the creation of a artificial town, an imaginary place, or to change a number on Prospect Street was to avoid legal problems in case there was a Zadok Allen or a Z Allen, which might be close enough. There's a famous story, not famous in this particular research community, but there was a pulp writer who wrote for Detective Story magazine who made the villain of one of his stories a Montreal lawyer and gave him a certain specific name. It turned out there really was such a guy. He sued. The publisher had to pay. The writer essentially was out of business. Okay, probably through no fault of his own. So lawsuits and legal issues are also a factor.
Yeah, no offense, I don't really think Lovecraft was terribly concerned about that. Although he does say, okay, you know, in Call of Cthulhu, which is set right here in Providence, takes place, you know, partly at Brown University, but he refers to a department of Semitic languages at Brown. I do not believe there ever was such a department. So to that degree, he avoided the real, and you know, because for the purpose of the plot development of the story. And in terms of Dunwich still, the area that Lovecraft set Dunwich in is still there, right? It's Wilbraham, Hampton, Monson is what he says. And some Athol. So those towns are still there, and you know they're near the Quabbin, but they're not right there. I mean, submerged. And of course, he adopted that region because that very summer, 1928, he visited an old friend, Edith Miniter, who lived in Pilgrim, and absorbed a lot of impressions from her about New England folklore that he incorporated right into the story.
Yeah, one of the towns that Will blanked on there was Dana, and Greenwich. I think you had mentioned there was a possible connection there that Lovecraft could have brought the two together to create a Dunwich out of it.
I gotta be honest, I reread my old articles after 20 years and I've forgotten most of them. And even now, I can't recall very much of them. I'm just doing the best I can.
Steve, we were just in Kingsport. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Kingsport is typically said to be modeled upon Marblehead, and again, there's been a lot of ink spilled about certain buildings, which buildings match up to the buildings that are actually in Marblehead and so forth. And Kingsport was also mentioned in The Strange High House of the Mist in kind of a different context almost. So, as Will mentioned, Lovecraft would use these cities or geographical locales as the story narrative called for, and had the flexibility to modify it to further the narrative. But one thing I wanted to mention was that, and I'm not sure whether this came up in the panel on life, but Lovecraft was a very deep student of New England history. His uncle, Franklin Chase Clark, was a member of the Rhode Island Historical Society, and I suspect that this sort of blank period when Lovecraft was not in high school and before he was involved in amateur journalism, that Lovecraft spent a lot of time in local archives reading primary material and reading the bulletins of the Massachusetts Historical Society, to the point where he had a very, very deep knowledge of Massachusetts and New England history. And I think it's this kind of rich background that he works from, and he works in almost a playful way in order to be very crafty about how he would mix in fact with fiction. Over the years, I've constantly found little bits of fact where I thought there were little bits of fiction, and it continually, it tends to actually unnerve me, where I find that things are real when I didn't think they were real. And the most recent examples of this are, it ends up that there were actually alchemists in New England, much as we read about in Charles Dexter Ward. There were, in fact, practicing alchemists in New England. One of them was John Winthrop Jr., who was the son of the governor of Massachusetts. And there are letters in these archives that were published in the 10s and 20s between these alchemists that read very much like the letters in Charles Dexter Ward. And this is something that you discover, 20, 30 years after the fact. And frankly, it's alarming, and it's the kind of thing where Lovecraft is kind of sort of reaching out and sort of creating this disturbance to the point where it's very difficult to know fact from fiction, even with all the great annotations and the other information that we have. You're constantly finding these little bits of factoids that surprise you.
Now you're treading on my territory. I've written about that circle of alchemists, so similar to the correspondence of Joseph Curwen. New London, Connecticut, where I have worked for many years and near where I live, was founded by John Winthrop Jr. specifically to be an alchemical colony. Yes, that's what he says in these letters, and it's because he could not have the freedom he wanted in Massachusetts to continue with his alchemical experiments that he left Massachusetts and moved to Connecticut. And he called to him alchemists from the continent, just like in Charles Dexter Ward. And some of the letters remain untranslated. They were written in cipher, and they have wonderful symbols and so on. It was the ones that were published by the collections of the Massachusetts Historical Society were ones in plain English. But this is stuff that they don't want to hear about in New London, let me tell you. But he said specifically, I will call it New London because because it will be my new and more spiritual London in the New World. And even more than that, one of his friends was named Jonathan Brewster, and he was too extreme even for New London, so he took up residence in the debatable lands between New London and Norwich, very near where the Mohegan Sun Casino is today, only on the other side of the river. And he was trying to maintain his alchemical experiments, but he kept complaining about the Indians who were always bothering him because he was in their territory. How am I expected to find the stone when there are Mohegans banging on my door all the time? And this was so far, the only reason that it could be covered up, or that was that, of course, he became governor of Connecticut. He was an influential man, and he could protect most of his friends, but one at least of his disciples ended up being swept up in the Wethersfield witch hunts in the 1660s. So, yeah, Lovecraft somehow had read all of this stuff.
Like Steve, I find myself discovering fact where there's fiction in Lovecraft. One of the things I've noticed is that there's a strong desire to point to specific real-world points of interest and say, this is the place that inspired Lovecraft, as if Lovecraft couldn't come up with things on his own. And yet at the same time, there are many places that we still discover that he did use fictionally, real-world places. One I found several years ago, I think it's in Through the Gates of the Silver Key. Lovecraft mentions that Randolph Carter lives on Chambers Street in Boston. And that's long thought to be fictional because there is no Chambers Street in Boston any longer. Well, in the 1950s, there was some urban renewal in the west end of Boston, and Chambers Street was wiped out. And as a matter of fact, Lovecraft's friend, W. Paul Cook, lived at 17 Chambers Street. So that was undoubtedly where he got the Chambers Street reference from. One of my latest discoveries that Ken Faye was working on simultaneously was trying to track down Joseph Kerwin's house here in Providence. Lovecraft gives very explicit directions to where Kerwin's house is, but if you look at modern Providence, there's simply nothing there. Well, in the 30s, North Main Street was widened, and the house that Lovecraft had in mind was demolished. And in fact, it was the home at 6 Olney Street of Lovecraft's housekeeper, Delilah Townsend. So he had a reason for choosing that particular house. And recently I've gone through the archives of the colonial dames of Rhode Island and have found a photograph of that very house that Lovecraft had in mind. So Lovecraft, it's funny how on one end he will falsify real information by changing the address of a house, and yet using houses such as the Fleur-de-Lis building, where he'll blatantly use obvious houses. There will be no hiding in it.
Well, that is public, but it's not a private residence, that's one.
True. And then on the opposite extreme, he'll have these hidden, almost inside jokes, as it were, that if you dig deep enough, you can find out it's a real place.
Let me speak to that for a moment. You're talking about the two essential techniques of writers of that time and today, verisimilitude and authenticity. Where you can use authenticity usefully and safely, you use it. When you want to evoke something and you don't want to specify it, you use verisimilitude, which is, Innsmouth sounds like a Massachusetts town because there's a million towns with that suffix.
But someone actually owned the Fleur-de-Lis building, and he says abominable things about the Fleur-de-Lis building. So he was terribly worried about being sued. The person who owned the Fleur-de-Lis building could have conceivably taken issue.
But that's a building, not a person.
It has the symbol.
Yeah, but you're not slandering an individual, which is where it's actionable. A building, when you criticize a building, I think that would be seen as a commentary, but I could be wrong.
I'm going to talk about Innsmouth now. I don't actually consider myself a Lovecraft scholar, and it's kind of weird being out here. But there's one example, and I didn't even really get into reading a gigantic amount of Lovecraft scholarship until around 1999, 2000. I ventured the first biography, and it sort of set it off. But because I always go to, and actually I started out as a Southern writer, I didn't come to New England really until I moved here in 2008. And what I'm about to talk about actually took place and started in 12 years ago. But I was writing a story called From Cabinet 34, Drawer 6, And I wanted to use, and it's set, and it's a contemporary story, but I wanted to set it, it's about Innsmouth. And so I became, because in Birmingham, where I tended to set my stories, I mean, I would go down to the exact street corner, make sure I got a window right. It was just an obsession, it's the way I write. It's something about my concept of sense of place. So I was like, well, Lovecraft does this thing in the Shadow over Innsmouth. He gives us a travel log, which is a little bit unusual, I think, for his stuff. He says, out the window, I could see the blue water and sandy line of Plum Island, and we presently drew very near the beach as our line of road veered off from the main highway to Raleigh and Ipswich. This definitely indicates that the direction of travel is in fact southeast, a little farther along. At last we lost sight of Plum Island and saw the vast expanse of the open Atlantic on our left. At this point, the road on which the bus is traveling begins to climb to higher ground. At the crest of the rise, the passengers, quote, beheld the outspread valley beyond, and the Monoxic joins the sea just north of the long line of cliffs that culminate in Kingsport, another HBO invention, and veer off toward Cape Ann. But for a moment, all my attention was captured by the nearer panorama just below me, and I realized, come face to face with rumor-shattered Innsmouth. And the narrator must at this point be looking to the east or southeast. I'm going to skip some stuff. If I'm going on too long, I'll show you. Yesterday, no, this is just me. Yesterday, which I believe was Monday, July 5th of 2004, we were up early, and despite the rain, headed for Massachusetts. One of my main objectives on this trip was to reach Ipswich and follow the Argyll Road northeast to the place where I believe Lovecraft meant the doomed seaport of Innsmouth to lie, at the mouth of the Castle Neck River, Monoxic to Lovecraft. The constant reader will recall that this was also the location I chose for the house where Narcissa Snow was raised by her grandfather, Blood Red Moon, that long spit of sand known as Crane Beach. This obsession began in October 2001 when I was working on an Innsmouth-related short story for Cabinet 34 Door 6 and began trying to locate Innsmouth using an M607. We took I-95 around Boston and into New Hampshire, driving out to Hampton Beach before turning south on 1A through Salisbury, Newburyport, and Raleigh to Ipswich. We paused at the oldest surviving headstone, blah, 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 blah. We crossed the Ipswich River and followed the Argyll Road to the spot where it ends at the sea. To the south of us, the marshes and islands of the mouth of the Castle Neck River, i.e. Monoxic, spread out flat and green, seeming almost impenetrable. In the near distance, Kite Island arose from the marshes, studded with old trees and shadows. We left the car and, walking east, crossed the dunes on foot, then followed Crane Beach south and east for a mile or so. There's a whole bunch of natural history I'm going to skip. I found blah, blah, blah. Off to the north and east across Ipswich Bay, the southern tip of Plum Island was a distant blue ghost. It was all perfect and the best end, blah, 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 for this trip. The day left us exhausted and wet, but determined to return to Ipswich and Crane Beach for further explorations. I had been to Innsmouth. And, we just followed the route. We basically followed the route that's set forth in the story as closely as you can follow the route, lining it up with historical roads. And using the peninsula of Cape Ann, imagining that, well, we must have looked at Gloucester and said, well, I want a seaport, but I want this rotten old doomed seaport. And he moved it north to which is actually, instead of having this harbor that Gloucester has, which is kind of a friendly place for boats, the North Shore is a very forbidding place. It's a very harsh, stark place for all its beauty. So that's my kind of Lovecraft scholarship.
One of the things, Robert Martin wrote an article in Lovecraft Studies where he talks about the location of Innsmouth. There's been a lot of articles about where Innsmouth is located. What Robert Martin suggested was that Lovecraft took the North Shore between about Essex and Newbury and stretched it out and made it longer so that Plum Island ends earlier and there's an area south of it that doesn't actually exist in the real world. The view that the narrator, Shadow over Innsmouth, describes as the valley outspread below is somewhat reminiscent of the view from the Old Town Hill Reservation in the town of Newbury, right north of the Palmer River, which Lovecraft did hike to the top of. And so if you hike to the top of that, preferably in a season where there's not too many leaves on the trees, you will see a view somewhat similar to this. But the problem is, when Lovecraft talks about the rise in the land, the cliffs in the distance, Essex County, the shoreline along there is very flat. And there's not too many rocky promontories or what have you. And so a lot of what he says here, you simply can't relate it to the real world because it just doesn't mesh up.
Yeah, you get the rocks up near Ipswich, and then you get the rocks down in Cape Ann. There's this stretch in between.
Yeah, it's all sand in between.
And I mean, it's clearly, one of the things that caught me was the Castle Neck River does this really weird thing. Right before it hits the bay, it does this crook.
It's almost a delta.
And it has the same crook that the river has, which is a very strange crook in the Shadow River incident. And that was the first thing that got me, was the crook in the river.
One theory related to Innsmouth that I just actually mentioned to ST, like everybody here, I'm fascinated by this story, and it struck me that the concept of going to the Far East and coming back with something strange, that concept is really not coming out of Marblehead or Gloucester, but it's really coming out of Salem. Okay, because this is where the whaling industry was run out of largely, and the China trade. So here, if you were going to Sumatra, you had the pepper trade, and if you were going to bring Fiji Islanders back, that was all going to happen through Salem. So here's another example where there's this conflation of multiple sources into a single source, and when you start to look into the trade that Salem had with the East, there's some remarkable similarities, and a lot of these extremely wealthy merchants were in Salem rather than these towns, which were really local fishing towns that were not going to the Far East.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the interesting things is that there were so many, during the time of the China trade, there were so many ships from Salem going to China that the people there thought Salem was a country. That's how prevalent the merchant ships from Salem were.
And what all these places have in common, and it's a common theme also with Dunwich and Western Massachusetts, is that they had passed their glory days. They were in decadence. They were in decay. The articles that Lovecraft read growing up that just wrote off Western Massachusetts and Western Rhode Island, saying that these areas are so hopelessly inbred and decayed that the only thing that should be done to them is to drown them to make reservoirs. Which is why reservoirs could be pushed through so easily, because the people in the capitals didn't think anything of the people out there. And the same thing with the North Shore had been written off by Lovecraft's time. Newburyport was in complete decay. So you have the decaying buildings and large hotels of Newburyport combined with the rich merchants, the decaying rich merchants' houses of Salem, combined with, as Caitlin said, the geography of the North Shore.
Yeah, I always caution people about too much speculation, because I think Lovecraft did take pieces of a lot of different things and create an amalgamation. One complete speculation I came up with was that Innsmouth was the town of Patuxent, south of here, because it's on the Patuxent rather than the Manoxet River. And the way the Patuxent River had a mill right at its mouth and a bridge, and the way it turns, the river turns south to dump into the bay past a spit of land, much like the Manoxet turns south past a spit of land to dump into the ocean. So there's a lot of similarities. If you look, you can find those similarities in a lot of places. Too many places. More places than Lovecraft probably saw.
Steve, I would love you to talk about our trip to Colorado Space Country. Now, I know Donovan actually disputes some of what you found, and we could have an interesting discussion. I have nothing to say about this, but,
ST's going to drop a bomb.
That's right. Let you two knock heads, but we just have to tell that story about.
Well, actually, we're in violent agreement on this. It's not really that controversial, but where this research came out of, and a lot of this can be done on the internet now, God bless it, was that again, you start ruminating about these stories that you love and that haunt you. The Color Out of Space. The Color Out of Space is a story that does not have a lot of footnotes yet. He's got a lot of good annotation. But The Color Out of Space seems to be one of these works of art that is very difficult to analyze or explicate because it's so perfectly finished. There's hardly a word out of place, and it seems like a prose poem, and it seems like it's completely finished. It doesn't need to have any real background, but the lead that Lovecraft left in part was that this potentially was based on land that was covered by the Quabbin Reservoir. So as it happened, there's a person named J.R. Green, who is a historian of Quabbin, who's published 6 or 7 booklets, and there exists maps of these towns that Will mentioned, which include Prescott and Pelham and Greenwich and Old Salem. So it was a matter of a short course to take these old maps that were in these books and lay it over the existing Quabbin Reservoir. And then when Lovecraft says in the story that there was a road that cut across the blasted heath, and no one wanted to use that road, so there was a road that was cut far to the south. Well, if you look at the area that was covered by the water, there's really only one area that corresponds to that. And then when you start to look further at the names on the map are oftentimes the same as the names in the story. So you have Pierce, for example. The Pierces were the primary settlers of this area. And the declivity where they turn around and look back from the top of a hill down into the valley is exactly the same. That's where the reservoir filled in, this tremendous drop. So you can more or less find the road that Lovecraft might be referring to, where this farm would have been. And physically the farm fits in with the grasslands or the grazing lands up above, the well down below, and a small stream. With this in mind, ST and I got in the car and went up there and drove to this location. And you can walk to the water and the water's edge and see where this road would have gone over or under now. But the one piece of information that we couldn't find is some of the names of some of the other characters, including the gardeners, in particular Nabby Gardner, the wife. So as it happened, I had picked up a map at a gas station, and there was mention of some ash kilns that were in the area, and they did a lot of burning of wood for charcoal, and my conjecture was that the ash from the burnings had caused some of the graying of the area, and this could have been part of the inspiration for this blasted heath where everything was constantly gray. But when we followed that map and went to the kiln, we noticed there was a small marking, and it said Gardner Cemetery, and it was about a half mile or so from this kiln. So we drove out, and ST, why don't you finish the story because you tell it better than me.
I don't know if I can or not, but I think we first passed, this area is very remote, okay, and quite frankly, it was, what occupants there are, some of these survivalist types, these camps and everything, and so we couldn't quite figure out where to go, so we made we made a wrong turn, as it turns out. Went up to this road where there were these sort of, I wouldn't say exactly a camp, but it was a house owned by, these people who did not seem to be happy that we were there. And so we just asked, hey, where's this Gardner Cemetery? He says, oh, it's on Scary Road. Yeah, right, you're pulling it. Well, as it happens to do is Skerry. Yeah. Anyway, so it was just the next corner. So we went down Scary Road, and sure enough, there's a little sign, wooden sign saying Gardner Cemetery. Now, we did find a bunch of Gardner graves, but I said, there's no chance we would find a Nabby Gardner, because that's a nickname for Abigail. I would assume you would never find a nickname of that sort put on a gravestone. But sure enough, someone at our party says, "Here's Nabby Gardner." God, I was flabbergasted. We didn't find Nahum Gardner, no, but we did find Nabby. Now, what does Donovan have to say about all this?
Oh my goodness! Throw the grenade. My opinion on the Colorado Space Reservoir is simply that it's the Scituate Reservoir, which provided water for Providence. The Quabbin's easy to point to because it provided water to a very large city, the city of Boston, and so it's a very conspicuous reservoir. But when you think about it, Lovecraft was living in Providence. The Scituate Reservoir would have been all over the pages of the Providence Journal, which he read daily. And so I think it would have been a much more conspicuous reservoir to him. In addition, the He traveled through the area, demolished for the Scituate Reservoir, and he doesn't describe it in terms of a blasted heath, but he does talk about houses being razed and even trees being pulled down, so the area being covered by the reservoir would be clear and available for drinking water. So it was a blasted heath of sorts, man-blasted by mechanical machines and what have you. And I think the road that he talks about that they had to go south of was probably the old Plainfield Pike that used to cut right through the Patuxent Valley. And that's another thing. The Patuxent Valley, he had family that lived along the Patuxent Valley, the Phillips family. He wrote for the Patuxent Valley Gleaner. I don't have any incredible coincidences like you guys have come across. And I don't know if Lovecraft could have made it out that far.
But the story is, let's face it, it is set in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Rhode Island, so.
Actually, I'm not certain of that.
That's all I can think.
Yeah, I'm actually not convinced it's set in Massachusetts. He opens the story by saying west of Arkham.
Far west, indeed.
Right, but how far west, and where's Arkham at that point? Remember the picture in the house, he mentions Arkham as a place name and doesn't say where it is. And somewhere else, he says west of Arkham, but again, he doesn't say where Arkham is.
But see, this is exactly what Lovecraft does to you. He gets you going, all right? And all of a sudden you're like, wait a second, is this real or not? I'm not sure. So we both may be partially right or partially wrong, but this is how he gets you going. He puts a little bit of fact and a little bit of fiction, and then he leaves the rest to mystification. And it's in playing. It's a sense of play, as somebody mentioned earlier, and it's a sense of being very canny about what he shows and doesn't show. And the probability of standing in the middle of nowhere in front of a grave with his name on it is like virtually zero. It's incredibly high. It's very unlikely. So again, when it really comes down to less about who's right or who's wrong, but I mean, this is what Lovecraft does to you mentally and emotionally. Is you start to. It becomes difficult to decide what to believe, and that's really what he set out to do.
And one of the reasons you look for this stuff is you go digging a little bit, sometimes you find those things. You find things that are incontrovertibly true. And then you start thinking, well, what about this really difficult mystery? How far can I take that? Will I find something out? One of the things I'm researching now is some similarities between the burial, the disposition of Joseph Curwen and the disposition of Providence's founder, Roger Williams. There's a lot of similarities in how they were buried, how they were removed, coffins they were placed in, markings on graves, that sort of thing. It may all be purely coincidence.
One thing I wish we knew was how Lovecraft in fact pronounced Dunwich. I would like to think he pronounced it Dunwich, because that's also probably, isn't that the British pronunciation?
Yes.
Because the likelihood is that he derived the name from the British coastal town. I think it's in Essex. I can't remember which county of England it's in. It's on the east coast of England, and it's slowly, rotting into the sea. Now that sounds like Innsmouth, but in fact he got the name Dunwich clearly from the town there, because it was not only Swinburne wrote a poem about it, although he didn't actually mention Dunwich in that poem, but everybody knew that that's the poem he was talking about, or the style he was talking about. And it's also mentioned in Arthur Macklin's short novel, The Terror, and I think that's where Lovecraft got the name from. But we do not know. The only other mention of Dunwich in Lovecraft, aside from the Dunwich Horror, is the poem, The Ancient Track. And that would have helped if it was at the end of the line, where we could tell what the rhyme would be, but it's not at the end of the line, it's in the middle of the line, so we do not know.
I have no idea how people in the 20s and 30s pronounce place names in Rhode Island, but now, and I'm not a native, but now I hear people say Greenwich or Greenwich, and it drives me crazy. I'm like, Greenwich. But,
there are differences in pronunciation of such names between Rhode Island and Connecticut.
Yes.
So,
Mark Michaud, NecronomiCon Press, always said West Warwick. He did not say Warwick. That is an older pronunciation, but I think that's dying out now.
Well, let me pick this one up from Donovan, since Donovan is researching the Ward burial. Going back to Salem, one thing that I noticed in reading about Salem is that, as we know, the name Curwen probably comes out of Salem, because this was the name of the the judge in the Salem witch trials,
Corwin.
Jonathan Corwin, okay, or variant Kerwin. But what ends up happening is you learn that the sheriff who did the actual hangings was George Corwin, or Kerwin, and there was such outrage over these hangings in Salem that when this other individual, the sheriff, died, they were afraid that the people would come and disfigure his grave. So he was buried in the basement of his house for some period of time in Salem, until such time as it was felt safe that he could be disinterred and buried. And this is in the current Joshua Ward house in Salem. So here you have Kerwin or Corwin and Ward. And it ends up that a descendant of the Kerwins or Corwins, that male line ran out, and one of the descendants had his name changed from Ward to Kerwin. So here's another tie-in from Salem that again is just another conflation or mixing in with potentially some of these other things.
Yeah, the Joshua Ward house is purported to be haunted by the ghost of the George Traveler.
Well, speaking of Salem, these things didn't end with the 17th or 18th century. I should say Danvers, which was the original Old Salem village. One of the victims of the witch hysteria was George Jacobs, who was hanged as a wizard, condemned by his own grandchildren who testified against him. And maybe because they felt guilty or whatever, apparently they saved his body out of the common grave and hid it. And they hid it in, but known to the family in their own farm. And when the farm was sold for development in the 50s, the last survivor disinterred the bones of great-great-great-grandpa the wizard and gave it to the Danvers Historical Society. And lest you think I'm making this up, somebody from the Danvers Historical Society told me that they didn't feel able to publicly reinter these bones for fear of stirring up witch hunts. And so they kept these bones in their vault, that is, in their archives, right there with the books, and so, until 1992, and the tercentenary of the witch trials, when finally poor George was buried in the cemetery of the Rebecca Nurse Homestead, whose family had done the same thing for her body, but they had buried her on their land, which was still in the family.
And the Rebecca Nurse Homestead, by the way, Lovecraft visited the site. Actually was able to get up into the attic of the site. You can still visit it today. It's a wonderful old house. And the private graveyard they have, they moved a number of witchcraft victims' bodies to this graveyard that's down a hill behind the nurse homestead. It's a really wonderful place to go visit if you get an opportunity. And not too far from the site of the old Danvers Asylum, which is now condominiums.
Yeah. And we need I knew someone who was an urban explorer who did these terrifying explorations of Danvers just before they started tearing it down. And I mean, really scary, terrifying, going to the attics and stuff, posting photographs, and finally got caught by the police. It was this epic tale that he told of hiding from the police in the attic and all this.
They had so many people trespassing on the place to do urban explorations, photographs, that finally the City of Danvers Historical Society set up something where on a monthly basis they would have tours through the place. You just had to sign up in advance. So they were hoping to encourage people to come to the tours and thus discourage them from trespassing on the property.
But that doesn't have a thrill.
No, certainly not.
Was that where they filmed Session 9, that movie about 10 years ago?
Yeah.
I was on that movie set. Yeah, I remember going through that place. It was really creepy. You'd have
Session 9?
Yeah, Session 9.
You'd have ceiling paint and wall paint that's like molting snake skin. It was just peeled off in giant scabs. It was very freaky. And there were tunnels, conduits for electrical cables that you could walk through. It was very strange.
And the set is already
So that's all gone now?
I think a lot of Lovecraft's stuff about asylums often come from Butler Asylum too. Although he says he never set foot in the building, every time, he never went to see his father, as far as we know. Some people conjecture that he might have, but I don't believe he ever did, because he was so young, and they wouldn't have let him see his father in that condition when he was 3, 4, 5 years old. Even when his mother went into that hospital from 1919 until her death in 1921, Lovecraft always says he met her on the ground. So he's found out, I think he has some sort of phobia of hospitals in general and psychiatric hospitals in particular. So he actually never went indoors to Butler, but I think all his memories of Butler came out in these various asylums that he set up, real or fictitious.
He certainly saw it from the exterior. There's a building on the grounds, the Richard Brown House, which is the oldest brick house in Providence, that is still there. And so he talks about that house in his letters as well.
What's that? No.
Well, one thing I want to mention, we were talking about session 9 a few minutes ago. It was filmed at the old Danvers State Hospital, and a portion of the hospital is still there. It's of the main building, about a quarter of it stands. The central administration building, and 2 wings, one on each side. Formerly, there were a total of 8 wings, 4 on each side. It was a Titanic building, very creepy. It had a couple of churches, 2 churches. It was a self-contained community up there where they had a farm, animals, vegetable, fruit, their own laundry, the whole 9 yards. In fact, when it opened, it was much like a resort because they felt that the patients there needed open air and space to recuperate. And the people of Danvers were pretty ticked off that these people who were at this mental hospital had it better off than they did. They were, going to work every day. And keep in mind, this was an era when homelessness was a sort of illness where homeless people would be interred in mental hospitals and whatnot. Eventually, the population of the hospital got out of control and became pretty much a snake pit. And by I think the 1980s, they deinstitutionalized most of the people, and then they didn't know what to do with this big building. So they talked about turning it into an historic site, and there just weren't the finances for the town to do that, so they made it condominiums. So they demolished about 3/4 of the main building and all the outlying buildings. And now they're also building condominiums adjacent to it. So it's a gorgeous location up on top of Hawthorne Hill.
Do we want to talk about Foxfield?
I was actually
the only one who knows anything about
I was going to bring that up as the very last thing.
Not that anybody knows anything about it, really.
Exactly. Go for it.
Lovecraft's a lost town.
You discovered the map, right, ST?
Right.
You pick it up.
All right.
Yeah, actually, when ST and Dave found this map and gave it to Will, I was thinking, is this an April Fool's joke? Are they just pulling poor Will's leg?
All right. In what are the so-called Arkham House transcripts, what these are when Derleth was starting to compile the selected letters, and Derleth had one, right? People, Lovecraft's correspondents would send letters to him at Arkham House, and he has a secretary, Alice Conger, type these letters up. Not necessarily in full, unabridged, but in fact, in some letters that are on sale, you can see Derleth's little markings as to indicating what portions this secretary should transcribe. So they produced 41-volume, single-spaced typescripts, averaging about 100 pages each, some much smaller, some a little larger. And in one of these Arkham House transcripts, there is what looks like a photostatic copy. They didn't have photocopiers as such, but they had a photostatic copy of a hand-drawn map by Lovecraft, indicating, I think it's called the Plan of Foxfield, Massachusetts. With Dunwich, I can't remember the direction. Dunwich is this way, and or whatever. So there's a little town. He has fairly detailed, landmarks of this various town with the river running through it and all that. Clearly post-dating Dunwich Horror because the Dunwich is in there. And obviously he never mentioned the site, never used it in a story. But it's another town that he would have used at some point if he got around to it.
In analyzing the map, it seemed to be in the general Dunwich area.
Yeah.
And in reading Lovecraft's letters, he once described the town of Deerfield as the summit of his earthly ambitions as a tourist.
It's a beautiful town.
Massachusetts. So I kind of linked Foxfield with Deerfield. although I think the name might also derive partly from Foxborough, which is, you know, not in that general area. And it's always intriguing to think what he might have done with that locale, because there are specific things there, a gorge, a couple of mills. Were they mills?
Yeah, I think there was a mill and a ruined bridge or something.
Ruined bridge.
Yeah.
And you know,
it looked very Dunwich-like because of the ruined buildings and whatnot.
Yeah, you know, he had yet again another one of his original rivers or streams. And I mean, the first time I looked at the Miskatonic, because he always said those names were jumbles of Algonquian roots, the first time I looked at it and tried to analyze it from the standpoint of Algonquian syllables, it seemed to be Miskatonic meant Red Mountain Place. And of course, in that area of Dunwich Harbor, they have these red sandstone hills. So that seems to me that even when he was claiming he was making up these river names just by combining roots, that he was actually, you know, thinking it through. Which again is the surprising part, because we always assumed Miskatonic was just a variation on the Housatonic River, but in fact it was more of a well-constructed, meant to signify or give further clues as to the locality if you happen to speak Algonquian.
One thing I find interesting about all these different locales that Lovecraft creates is that with Dunwich, you can point to the areas of Wilbraham, Hampton, and Athol and say Lovecraft got some impressions here and incorporated them, but there's nothing really concrete. If you look at Arkham, it kind of coalesces in time. It starts out as a little more than a place name, but after he writes the thing on the doorstep, from then on out, he says Arkham is Salem, even though there were elements before that where it wasn't quite clear where it is. And then with Innsmouth, he says Innsmouth is a considerably twisted version of Newburyport. And he says that repeatedly. And so it's clearly he's getting elements from Newburyport, and yet we still think, well, is there some Gloucester in there? Is there some Essex and Ipswich? And so there's so many questions raised by those three towns. But with Kingsport, there's really no question. Kingsport he mentions earlier in the Terrible Old Man, that's right. And in fact, Philip Treffler makes the error in the H.P. Lovecraft Companion of saying the Pirate's Hideout inspired Lovecraft to create the Terrible Old Man, even though that was 3 years before Lovecraft visited Marblehead that he wrote the Terrible Old Man. And yet clearly when he writes the festival, that is his homage to Marblehead. We may debate which buildings contributed to that, whether this building or that building was what Lovecraft had in mind. But it seems like it's the one most concrete place. And I'm wondering if it's partly because he loved Marblehead so much, whereas Newburyport was a town he visited. You know, these other places where he really clearly appreciated Salem and its history and architecture. But Marblehead, he was just in love with that town. And I think that's why it's so concrete.
I'm sure that's the case. You know, ST disagrees with me, even though we haven't had this argument in 20 years, but I'm reasonably convinced Lovecraft got the name Kingsport from Kingsport, Tennessee. And the reason I think that is the Kingsport Press in Kingsport, Tennessee was and is a fairly famous press. In those days, you could see ads for it in the writers' magazines. And that's where I first became aware of it. So, you know, and also Kingsport is an alternate theory. Kingsport is the name of a balustrade or something that's an architectural element in stairwell. So he could have got it from that or both. But, you know, there is nothing like Kingsport in Greater New England. But there is a Kingsport in Tennessee, and it was famous in its time for its press. So make it that way you will.
There's Kingston in Rhode Island.
Oh, there is Kingston.
Many cities with the port.
There's one in Massachusetts, too. But as a coinage, Kingsport could easily have come from Kingsport, Tennessee. Just because he came across the name in a writer's magazine.
Well,
or
I'm not even sure he was looking at a writer's magazine as early as that.
Again, it was a very famous press. So, you know, it would be, any literary person would have been aware.
Well, if you found an ad for it in like the Argosy, that would be a good clue.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, he had a sunset vision in Marblehead, very similar to the sunset visions that you find described in Providence. Same terminology. But the other thing about Marblehead that really did carry over into Innsmouth is that Marblehead was famous for being insular and inbred. there was even in the folklore collections, he didn't have to go to Marblehead, and all the folklore collections that he read, they had their own dialect. Marblehead was known for having dialectal words that existed nowhere else. There was a Marblehead look, very similar to, not quite like the Innsmouth look, but supposedly you could tell Marbleheaders. And so there's much as he adored the architecture of Marblehead, he also had to be aware of these stories about its inbred inhabitants.
All right, so that's our hour. We're going to open it up to questions at this point, and then give everybody time for the next panel. Yes?
Most of the discussion of the use of real places, whether they're fictionalized or Providence not fictionalized, most of the discussion says that Lovecraft used it to put a sense of verisimilitude to the reader. But do you think it might have worked the other way around? As a writer of fiction, he might have been using bits and pieces of real places in order to give himself a sense of actuality.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. I think he needed to base his own imagination on reality, as Kiernan says you do in some ways. But he uses that as a springboard for these imaginative jaunts. You know, a lot of these stories start in Arkham and Providence and Kingsport and Innsmouth. They don't stay there. But he uses that as a sort of solid foundation for his
I think
imagination.
that successful, and especially sometimes successful weird fiction, it gains an authenticity by having an intimate knowledge of whatever the setting is. You know, whether it's an old mill in Birmingham, Alabama, or a seaport in Massachusetts. You need to, it doesn't matter if you change the name or you create a camera with several different seaports, you need to know what a seaport in Massachusetts would be like. And I wouldn't dare try to write about one if I hadn't visited one repeatedly and read and everything that Lovecraft did do. So in that sense, yeah.
In a way, I thought that Lovecraft, in the Thunder and the Doorstep, for example, the reason he uses Salem names is to provide that Salem background, that history of the town, history stretching all the way back to the witchcraft trials, without having to write it out, and being able to get right to the story, and provide that setting without having to write the setting, just providing names like Crown and Shield, Derby, Salt and Stalin, witch-haunted, or witch-cursed legend haunted, terms like that, was a shortcut to give it the background without having to write it.
First of all, you mentioned Marblehead as being almost exactly Kingsport, but there's no gallows in Marblehead, which you mentioned as investment. So it's another example of taking reality and expanding it. But nobody's talking about Bolton.
Bolton, my opinion of that is, remember, I think that Lovecraft's naming of Arkham goes back to Arkwright and the mills and what have you. Over in the west of England, there's a lot of mill towns there, and one of the best known mill towns is Bolton. And I think that's, once again, that's Lovecraft's conjuring something up of the Miskatonic Valley and its mill villages and so on. And I don't think he was aware of the fact that there is a Massachusetts Bolton. He mentions it very late in his letters once, because he took a train or maybe drove through there with one of his friends. And that is literally the only mention I can find in any of his letters, very late in life. And so my guess is he didn't know that the Massachusetts Bolton existed. He just borrowed the UK Bolton and inserted it again for color.
You mentioned earlier how Salem, Massachusetts was one of the main entry points for a trade and perhaps also for a immigration. You know, there is a really something about Lovecraft that sometimes he expresses set along borderline races, comments.
Borderline.
So do you think that Arkham, he basically saved it will be also because of those qualities that he had? He had like he associated with them. He has like an point of view on Salem, ultimately acting here.
I don't know if he had that feeling about. Yeah, he probably didn't have that feeling about Salem, Innsmouth. That element, he certainly incorporated Innsmouth. The fact that that the people from Innsmouth made deals with South Sea Islanders and bred with them and with deforms. There is, outside of this, fear of that and learning that the story you are the outside. So that's definitely clear there. In Salem, it's interesting because as we said earlier, Salem was responsible for more of that than other ports. But Newburyport in its time was a fairly significant port with a lot of shipbuilding and what have you. And in Lovecraft's time, it had fallen on very hard economic times, and all of that was already in history at that point. So it's possible he took some of that from a variety of different sources. Again, it's an amalgamation of a lot of things. Yes?
Yes, I find this all very, very stimulating. My question is, I wonder if there's a Lovecraftian atlas that's treated as the research and
For those who didn't hear, he asked about whether there's a Lovecraft atlas out there.
There's tidbits of that. Like in Philip Schreckler's book, he's done a little bit of that. There's a variety of different articles. Like obviously, Will's got a good dozen articles in Cryptid Cthulhu and Lovecraft studies. Steve's got a few articles like that as well. Jason Eckert has a book, Off the Ancient Track. That's a small book, but I'm sure it's on sale somewhere in the dealer's room. Robert Martin's article that was in a fairly late issue of Lovecraft Studies it's not a guidebook as it were, but it talks about a lot of theories behind where Lovecraft's real world locations are. And that's actually something I'm working on at the point. Who knows when I'll get it done. I keep scaling it up and then scaling it back, but I do want to write a pretty comprehensive book on all these real world points of interest. Yes?
I'm just wondering what you can speak to about when Lovecraft writes outside New England. I mean, well outside New England. For instance, I'm a huge fan of some of the ghost writing, like something interesting in the Southwest, where you still do get a firm sense of place, despite the fact that you never can go.
Well, that's interesting because the very first story he wrote for her, The Curse of Yig, he sent in a letter to you. Yeah, I followed a lot of the topography that you answered in my questionnaire. So he must have asked her a lot of questions about topography and even history, although he could have boned up on the history, but he certainly didn't had any first-hand knowledge of the topography, but she must have answered a lot of questions because she lived in Oklahoma and told him a lot about that area.
Well, like the mound, for example, I think she supplied like a sentence about, there's this ghost, this headless ghost, and this, female and male ghost, and that was about it. That was literally about it, and he just went hog wild. There's not much local flavor in that. It's mostly his underground realms and what have you. Yes?
There's a quote I read over now that says that he wanted to craft his stories like hoaxes.
Yeah, he said you need to craft it with all the verisimilitude of a hoax.
And the HPL Historical Societies, when they're top bots together, he said that actually all these things happen, and these are actual articles. So I wonder how much the mixing of real with unreal was to give it this sort of feeling of, well, yes, it is.
Yeah, it kind of goes, interestingly enough, that goes back to what Caitlin was saying earlier, how much of it is completely fictional, and why did he do so when he did create so many things that were real? For example, in the Call of Cthulhu, the earthquake he mentioned, where Rillier rises, that earthquake was felt right here in New England, a pretty rare occurrence. Lovecraft would do things such as, if in his story it's March 15th, and there's a full moon, you got to make sure there really was a full moon on this day. He would go to those kinds of extremes in his stories. It was clearly very important to him. And yet he was obviously pretty complex because he would strongly fictionalize real world things to the point where they couldn't be recognized as real world places. And then he would incorporate real world places fully in his stories without fictionalizing them in any way. So he ran the gamut.
Well, I think that there are degrees. He wants to write about New England, or he's in a more fanciful mood. So he reads something about the Transantarctic Mountains, or he reads something about Australia, and he's a truly alien landscape. So he moves off to the Transantarctic Mountains or to the Outback, and where people can't really dispute much about what he's saying, and so he has a greater amount of freedom. And then when he wants even more freedom, you get the Dreamlands. You get a truly high fantasy world, the Dunsany world. So I think it's a matter of degree as to what he needs for any given work, what he wants to do for any given work.
Yes.
Talk about horses. There's a long history of cryptozoology in New England. Bigfoot, Wendigo, spectral moose in Maine. Is there any research done, or are any of you familiar with how that cryptozoology and like the local legends of the DC area of New England might have affected his writing?
In terms of cryptozoology, I haven't thought of anything like that, but I know didn't he have Samuel Drake's books on legends of New England? So he was familiar with many of those. I think there was a collection of short anecdotes about a variety of myths and folk tales set in New England. He was very well versed in that. Specific cryptozoological things I'm not aware of. I think we have one question. Yeah, we have about time for one more question. Or way in the back here.
It's pronounced by the way.
Yeah.
He's Greenwich.
Yeah, Greenwich. Yeah, I always say Greenwich, Greenwich because I say them both.
I always go back to a Dr. Seuss story where Greenwich has to rhyme with spinach.
One last point. Let us remember that Innsmouth was first invented in the story. This is another thing we don't know how he pronounced it. Celophaeus, Chelophaeus. I don't know. I say Celophaeus. It was set in England. Figure that out.
So that's much like what happened to Arkham, I think, where it's a place name to start with, and then it coalesces over time. All right. Well, thank you very much.